Welcome to White Rabbit Podcast, Thelema Broadcast, a broadcast dedicated to discussions on life from the perspective of those who accept the law of Thelema. Joining me today is my podcast partner, internationally known author, artist, and speaker, J.Daniel Gunther. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us today is our good friend, Ken Campo, fellow Thelemite, and aspirant in the great work. Welcome.
Thank you for having me here. Happy to be here.
Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Today's podcast is a bit impromptu. We had our good friend Ken Campo over visiting us for the weekend, and we got into a discussion on what publications and written word was out there to be found about the time that they were interested and begin to search for spirituality in their lives. This would have been some time ago, and it was before a lot of the more recent publications came out. About what time would this have been?
That would have been about 1967 for me. I think for Ken, about the same.
About the same, although I tried to read Eliphas Levi, Transcendental Magic, couldn't make much sense of it. I was pretty young at that time.
Yeah, so in 1967, see, I was 17 years old, and Ken was...
probably about 9.
About 9 years old. So there's a little age difference there, but we both kind of went into the field looking for material to read roughly around the same time. So it's very interesting from that standpoint. Yeah, that's really, and at that time, as you mentioned, there was not a lot of material available about Crowley and Thelema. It was a challenge, to say the least.
And at that time, where were you?
Physically, I was...
What part of the Americas were you in?
I was living in the state of Arkansas in 1967.
Seattle, Washington for me.
And where were you when you found, I guess, your first Crowley book, or your first book that really interests you and got you excited and interested in the realm of magic and mysticism?
Well, for me, Ken mentioned earlier, one of the first books that he tried to read was Eliphas Levi's Transcendental Magic, and ironically, it was the same thing was true of me as well. I attempted to read that, and probably like Ken, I was a little older, but I didn't understand very much of it at all. But I had begun a quest looking for useful and meaningful information, which led me down a long trail. I read everything I could get my hands on at the time. Edgar Casey, Gene Dixon. There was a book out called Here, Mr. Splitfoot. I read that. The Encyclopedia of Witchcraft and Demonology. I read a book by Richard Cavendish called The Black Arts. Ken, do you remember that?
Yes, and it was probably the first book I saw that mentioned Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, me too. That's exactly right. Richard Cavendish described in that book the encounter of Crowley and Newberg with Karanzan. And strangely, the only thing that really stuck in my head from that book, I can't remember very much else in that book except the name Aleister Crowley. And I read that in a college library in Arkansas, but as it turned out, I made a trip to California, and I was living in California, not far from San Francisco, and in a library, public library in California, as I was walking through the library doing what was my normal habit at the time, going through looking for anything and everything about spirituality, magic, whatever I could find, which was very little. I happened to be in the biography section, and I looked down and I saw a black book entitled The Confessions of Aleister Crowley. And I remembered the name, Aleister Crowley, from that Richard Cavendish book, The Black Arts. And I picked it up and thumbed through it and I remember distinctly a chapter called The Advent of the Aeon of Horus, and I was captivated. And I checked the book out and took it home and began to read it. That was my introduction to Crowley and Thelema.
The same thing here. The first book I found about Crowley was The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, and you have to understand at that time period the books were really limited. They started to come out in a trickle, and then that turned into just a steamroller.
Yeah, but that's where it began. When I read The Confessions of Aleister Crowley, I remember being astounded when I went to the bibliography, and I'm looking the back of the book, and you see all of the books listed under the authorship of Crowley, and they listed every liber in the AA and OTO list, and I was dumbfounded. I was just like, where are these books? I have to find these books. This is amazing. But more importantly, reading Crowley's story and reading The Advent of the Aeon of Horus, I was stricken by the Book of the Law and realized from Crowley's own account how important this book was. Where was it? Where could one find this book? And just as it turned out, I made a trip to San Francisco, and in San Francisco, there was a bookstore there. I believe the proprietor was a man named Jerry Kay, who had just published a pamphlet of the Book of the Law, which I purchased for the sum of $3. I was thrilled to have it at last, and I took it home to Walnut Creek, California, where I was living, and opened it up only to realize that the whole central section of the book was missing. All I had was chapter 1 and most of chapter 3. Chapter 2 in its entirety was missing. So there I was. I had the Book of the Law at last, but not completely. I made a trip back to San Francisco a week or so later, and I entered the store and I told the proprietor that I had purchased this book, but it was missing a part of it, a very important part. And he had a whole stack of them on the counter, and he grabbed one and said, well, here, have another one. Take this one. And as I was turning to walk away, there was a woman at the counter, and I remember distinctly she reminded me of Mama Cass and the Mamas and the Papas. She was a corpulent young woman, and a rather imposing figure. But I heard her say, oh, look, Magic and Theory and Practice is in print again. Well, I stopped in my tracks and turned around and looked, and on the corner of the counter was 3 or 4 light brown books, hardbound, stacked up, and it turned out it was the Castle edition of Magic and Theory and Practice. And it was on sale for $10. And as it turned out, I just happened to have $10 and some change in my pocket, and I purchased it without hesitation and headed back home with my treasures, the Book of the Law and Magic and Theory and Practice.
The other thing was, back in those days, the publishing standards weren't always very good. Like, you never knew what you were going to get. You might get a book that said, "Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law," or, something else strange that the author decided to put in. Another thing we were talking about is how if you ask for a book by Aleister Crowley, you might even get thrown out of the store.
That's true. I had I've often related the story myself of before I found this copy of the Book of the Law in Jerry Kay's store. I was in San Francisco, and I ran across a very interesting little bookstore. Had lots of books on occultism and magic, mysticism, philosophy, theosophy, and so on. A little old white-haired lady sat behind the counter, and I went up to her and I said, "Do you have a copy of the Book of the Law?" And she said, "Well, I've never heard of it." Well, I said, "Well, it's Aleister Crowley." Well, as soon as I mentioned the name Aleister Crowley, she bristled I don't carry that kind of material here. And I said, I've never heard of this book. And I said, well, he based his whole life on it. And she said, well, that's even more reason I wouldn't have it, because if he based his life on it, it must be evil and degraded. And now you get out of my store and don't ever come back. And she threw me out of the store.
And that prejudice is not gone completely. I know there was a bookstore in Orlando when I lived there. I can't remember the name of it, but it was a New Age bookstore also run by a little old lady. And a friend of mine told me that he had gone there and kind of moseyed around and asked if she had any books on Thelema and mentioned Aleister Crowley, and he had also gotten thrown out. And told to leave very politely, very coldly.
Well, the old lady in San Francisco did not tell me politely to leave.
I think there's one in every place that transports to different stores.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's different now than it was then. There was at that time in the early 70s, there was still quite a bit of animosity toward Crowley. And the material was just really quite rare. It was just hard to find. And, but like Ken said, too, the quality at that time, of course, we weren't experts in it by any stretch of the imagination, but we were at least astute enough to realize that when we would get a book that was of lesser quality, it usually stuck out like a sore thumb, that it wasn't good. Or they're changing, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, or do what thou wilt is the whole of the law, or whatever. It was a strange time, but it very quickly changed. Not long after that. In my case, as I said, I went home with my two treasures. I had Magic in Theory and Practice. I had the Book of the Law. And no sooner than I got home and I had those books lying on the couch with me where I was sitting, a girlfriend of a friend of mine came in and looked down, saw the books, and she said, "Oh, I have a book by that fellow." I said, "Really? What?" She said, "Yeah, it's called the Book of Thoth or something." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, you can have it if you want to." Oh, I said, "Of course I'll take it." Well, she went home and brought back, it was the paperback edition of the Book of Thoth, the Lancer publication, which, as it turned out, was a bootleg publication. Copyrights had not been well established at that time. But nevertheless, I was thrilled to have it. And for a good while, I had the Book of Thoth, Magic and Theory and Practice, and the Book of the Law, and that's all I had.
Now, when you say you had Magic and Theory and Practice, that was one of the chapters that you now find in Book 4. It wasn't...
Not one of the chapters, one of the sections. Book 4 is divided into 4 major sections. Magic and Theory and Practice is Section 3 of Book 4. And Crowley published that by itself in Paris in the 20s. I don't remember the exact date. And later, of course, with the publication of Book 4, edited by Hyman Espeda, we were able to finally combine Parts 1, which was on yoga, Part 2, which was on magic, Part 3, which is Magic and Theory and Practice, and 4, an account of the Book of the Law.
And looking at it today, the Blue Book, as it's commonly called, reads more like a college textbook. You have lots of references, and the quality is really high. Back in the day, you had a Castle edition of Magic, and you had a Simon's Grand edition, and they really weren't very good. And so things have come a long, long way. When people wonder about why there is such a big fuss about the copyrights, that's why. It was to control the literary output and the quality.
That's right. And we owe a real vote of thanks to Hyman Espeda for championing that stance. And you're right, a lot of people are confused about it. They don't understand why such emphasis was placed on that. But it's really important to guarantee the quality of our publications, both AA and OTO, that they are correct, that they're edited with quality, And as Ken said, that was not the case. That was not the case in the early 70s. I remember there was I still have these little pamphlets. I can't remember the people who wrote them. A commentary on magic and theory and practice. And it was, I don't know, I have 6 or 7 of them. I don't know how many volumes it was, but they were little paperback pamphlets. They were atrocious. And their understanding of the book was very poor too. But in those days, we were so hungry for anything we could get our hands on that we bought that. We bought everything we could find. It was difficult at that time sometimes to separate the wheat from the chaff. And so we have a great appreciation for the quality publications that have come to us through the editorial guidance of Jimenez Beta and in cooperation with the AA. So it's a really important point. Ken and I both, although there was 7 or 8 years difference in our age, we went through at the same time the struggle of trying to build a library that was decent. We were talking earlier about all the material that was available. At that time, at that time in the early 70s, I remember Llewellyn Publications had a magazine they published fairly regularly called Gnostica. And it was pretty much it covered everything from Wicca to, magic.
Everything?
Everything. I mean, anything and everything. We grabbed it up, of course, because we were hungry for information. And there was also an encyclopedia set that was published around that time called Man, Myth, and Magic. They were thin books. They were hardbound. I don't know, 19 or 20 volumes or something, but it also covered everything imaginable in, as the title suggests, Man, Myth, and Magic. And there was some information on Crowley there, which was really appreciated. I remember distinctly that they printed some of the paintings from the Thoth Tarot deck that were initial rough drafts or whatever. There was a copy of the Fool card, I recall, different than the one that's published in the deck, and so on. Really, really useful information. Ken mentioned earlier the Grant Simmons edition of Magic, which had its negative aspects too, some of the notes and so on. And another early publication that I recall of Crowley at that time, Llewellyn published Magic Without Tears, edited by Rigardi,
right,
as I recall.
Yes.
And it was for a long time, it was a real desert until around 1972, I believe the date was, Weiser Publications reprinted the Equinox. And I got my first set in 1974. Volume 1, 10 volumes, bound in white and gold, and the blue Equinox. That was a treasure trove for me. We owe a huge debt of thanks to Weiser Publication for all the books they brought out at that time, including one of which was really important to me was Book 4, Part 2, book on magic, which was the preface to the Magic and Theory and Practice. And oh my goodness, it seems like around that same time, Ken, if I'm not right, the diaries of Aleister Crowley.
Yes, there were the diaries of the B666, and then later on they did the diaries of a certain time period. I can't recall exactly.
Yeah, who was the editor of that? It was I've gone brain dead. I can't think.
Could be Stephen Skinner.
Stephen Skinner. That's right. That's right. Well, it's been a lot of years since those things came out, but we bought them all. Seems like around 74, somewhere around there, 75 maybe. 93 Publishing brought out the magical and philosophical commentaries
Oh, yes.
on the Book of the Law, which was, Crowley's commentary, and beautifully bound. I remember, beautiful blue cloth. It was stamped in gold on the front cover with the front of the stele revealing, and on the back was the back side of the stele, and it was printed in black and
red ink.
Black and red ink.
The text was in red ink. Yeah.
Had a couple of color plates in it. That was a really welcome publication at the time. It's pretty pricey if you can get your hands on one today. I imagine they didn't publish that many of them. But not long after that, this is when we started to see some of the strange things that showed up. 93 Publishing published a book called The Book of Perfection. And it was a paperback book that had on the front cover a rather strange looking entity with a hole in his chest where you could see his heart. And this was supposed to be I Was. And this was this book was supposed to be a Class A publication that was, as I recall it, the fourth chapter of the Book of the Law.
Yeah, and it was rather contrived if you read it, and it was really a mess.
Yeah. I remember it, my good friend Richard Gernon and I sat down together when we got this book. We were curious about it, of course. And in those days, we typically withheld judgment on anything until we could actually see it to decide whether or not it was genuine or whatever. We were somewhat bothered by that painting on the front cover, but we read the book out loud. And when we finished reading it, I never will forget, my good friend Richard looks at me and said, "What the hell?" I remember he didn't want the book in the house. He was very disturbed about it. And he took the book and, with my blessing too, took it out of the house. And I suspect it landed in the nearest trash can. He did not want it in the house. And he thought it was an abomination.
Yeah, I haven't seen too many copies of it since either.
No, I think
so
that
didn't
was
catch on.
The fate of many of them, actually. And then at the same time, there was publications coming out of California by a guy named Lee Heflin.
Oh, yes.
That was writing books that were supposedly inspired, and they were very unusual. They didn't last long in our library either. We decided that this wasn't exactly what we were looking for. So,
well, it was like the Wild Wild West back in those days. It was like a free-for-all, and anybody that came up with anything would put it out there as being valid and try to justify it.
Right. And eventually, the good won out, and more publications became available. We built our libraries selectively, and it became obvious after a while which ones were done well and with business way and which ones weren't, which ones were junk and which ones were real. And slowly and surely we were able to build our libraries of Crowley material. It took a while. One of the key factors was at that time, all of that Crowley material, the published books, were available if you could afford to find and purchase first editions. But very few of us, we were very young and trying to establish ourselves in the world, and very few of us could afford to purchase those first editions, and with the dollar amount on those, they were quite high.
Which is less than what they ask today. Ken, you were telling me about that first edition that you saw?
About 1976, I saw an edition of Magic in a store. There was an original edition, and it was $100, and it had a letter from Crowley in it, which started out, "Dear Lord So-and-so, I'm glad you enjoyed the drug." And if I could go back in time with $100 right now, I'd do it in a second.
Wow.
Yeah, it's amazing. And some of the first editions, of course, I remember my good friend James Wasserman owned a first edition of the Book of Thoth. It was the first time I'd ever seen one that was in his possession at that time. And I know he paid a pretty penny for it at the time. I was just bowled over at how beautiful it was. And really quite amazed at the care and quality that Crowley put into that book. Just a gorgeous book. And over the years, I've seen all the editions and first editions and so on. Now I'm much more concerned about having good quality copies. I'm not a collector of first editions and rare books. I'm much more interested in content, and I'm fortunate enough to own most of Crowley's writings in one form or another. But I'm like Ken, if I could go back in time and I had a few bills in my pocket from the deals that I've seen over the years at ridiculous prices. I mean, right now, for example, if you could find a first edition copy of Magic in Theory and Practice with a letter like that in it for $100,
Oh, yeah.
you'd snap it up in a heartbeat. But
Yeah, Grandma had it hiding under her bed and didn't know what it was.
right, that's right. That's absolutely right.
Well, there was also Golden Dawn books out at that time. I know you had previously told me you had found one pretty early on in your
Well, when I first set out upon the great work, I had, as I said, Ken and I both read Transcendental Magic, and then I traveled to California, as I mentioned, and a friend of mine bought me the Golden Dawn books in 2 volumes. It was a wonderful gift, and of course I began to immediately practice the magical rituals in there, the banishing, invoking, and so on. But the first book that I actually purchased that was a magical book was The Lesser Key of Solomon. I went to a bookstore and found that it was actually still in print, the DeLawrence edition, which was printed, the 20s or something. And I paid $3 for that book. It arrived, it was gorgeous, brand new, never been used. They must have printed a lot of them in those days that they never sold. And after I bought that one, I purchased a copy of The Greater Key of Solomon. So by the time I got to California, I had the Lesser Key, the Greater Key. I had, with a gift of my friend, I had the Golden Dawn books. And I had seen copies by then of The Secret Teachings of All Ages. It was out in paperback, not color, but it was available. And even at that point, some of Frater Ahad's books were being published. Now, there was a bookseller in Little Rock, Arkansas, many years ago that was rather fond of his works, and he had a couple of them, and first edition, and that was the first time I had ran across his name and saw that. So I was kind of introduced to all of that at the same time, but as it worked out, as I ran across books, I rather went through some of the same steps that Crowley did. I ran across the Lesser Key, the Greater Key, and then worked through the Golden Dawn system out of the books. And then I discovered Thelema.
Right.
And that's, it was a really good background for me, because when you first encounter Crowley, when I read the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, of course, Crowley's own background in his Golden Dawn training impacts so much. And if you have that background and education, it becomes a little easier to understand many of his references.
Yes, he's a bit more succinct than the Golden Dawn, because sometimes the Golden Dawn is like such an encyclopedia of magic.
Mm-hmm.
But often he went by the old proverb, the best symbol for a sharp knife is a sharp knife. And he'd be a little bit more succinct
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But that was how I came to it. And I have to say, even after I had Magic and Theory and Practice and the Book of the Law, I can't even remember how many times I read them. The first time I read Magic and Theory and Practice, it was like Greek to me. I didn't understand anything in there. And I read them and reread them and reread them. But I was able to, there was something there that grabbed me and wouldn't let go. And that's still true to this day.
I found a lot of times if you read certain passages out loud, that helps.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we did that too. Myself and a couple of friends of mine, we would take turns reading passages, and it wasn't always a matter of having a group discussion about it. It was just, like Ken said, to be able to hear it out loud. It sometimes created a resonance that would click in your head, would take you to the next step. But those days were a great training ground. I'm really glad we got to go through them. Students today, clearly, when they come to the AA, I can testify, are better prepared than they were 30 years ago. They have so much more material at their fingertips. It's there. When we started out, it wasn't there. Not easily. I mean, it wasn't easily found. So it was, we were like alchemists trying to seek the elusive gold, and
Or the dragon and the pearl.
yeah, right.
Well, I can tell you what was pretty easily available out there when I started looking. I think it was probably late 90s, early 2000s, and forward. I know a lot of the bookstores were flooded with books on natural magic, New Age stuff, mostly Wicca, which is what I initially started reading because that was really the only thing out there, and other various books on witchcraft and, stuff like that. And I had somebody randomly tell me I should read A Garden of Pomegranates by Israel Regardie. And I read that book, and it was astounding to me because it was not like anything I had ever read. And in that book, it talks about the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. And I'm not sure if it referenced Crowley or if it was in the footnotes.
No, it does. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a long time ago, but that book really got me interested in that direction of Kabbalah. And from there, I picked up the book of Thoth. And that was my first introduction into the new revelation of the Eon. And even though I didn't really know what he was talking about when he referred to that, because I hadn't read the Book of the Law yet, I read it about 5 times before I went on to another book. And I was like, Aleister Crowley, I had a friend tell me one time, don't ever get involved with Aleister Crowley because he'll really mess you up. And I was like, I'll keep maybe, what was his name again? That was my reaction. And so I went out, and book 4, The Blue Brick, was in Barnes and Nobles. And I had seen that book a couple of times, but, I never really picked it up because it was just a pretty daunting book, a book that thick, and it just says magic on it. But it had Aleister Crowley's name on it. And I had read the Book of Thoth, and at this time I was so interested that I was willing to pick up that book and actually try and read it. And I picked it up and I bought it full price. I think I spent $80 on it, about plus tax, $80 plus tax. And it was the beginning of, Thelema in my life, really from that point, because I had read the Book of the Law in there.
I can remember, speaking of, you mentioned Regardie, I have to give him a nod here too, because around 1975, I believe, Weiser reprinted Regardie's book, called The Tree of Life. And that was one of the places, the first time that I had read sections of things like, some of the holy books where Regardie quoted them. It was a general book about really a compilation of his notes over the years. Sometimes his notes were actually word for word. He'd copied out of Crowley's books, and it wasn't intentional plagiarism or anything like that. It was just a young, enthusiastic student writing down things that inspired him, and I took it for that. But it was very useful to me very early on, but back in those days, I recommended the book to more than one person as being very helpful, and I haven't seen it in quite some years, except for an old tattered copy.
It's still around
in my bookshelf. It's the same one that I had all those years ago, but it's very interesting. All these stories of how we reached there. You mentioned the blue brick, as it's irreverently called these days. I was fortunate enough to be able to be on the editorial staff that worked on that with the great Hymenaeus Beta, and our mutual friend Martin Starr was also there at the time, and I have a rather amusing story. It became apparent that the book was taking on enormous proportions at some point with the amount of footnotes and the size of the thing. And Martin Starr said, "This book has come to emulate the Almighty, having neither beginning nor ending."
Funny.
I'm not sure Hymenaeus Beta thought it was that funny, but I would.
But it feels that way when you're trying to read it too, especially if that's your real first introduction.
Right.
From beginning to end.
Yeah, but the bar was really raised with that book. If you ever saw the earlier editions, it's nothing like them. It's like a college textbook. It's really good.
Yeah, we were all really proud of it, and one of the points of emphasis on that book and some others is the ongoing collaboration between the AA and the OTO, which has resulted in the presentation of so many books that are so helpful, and we're all proud of them. The Heart of the Master, the Tao Te King. My goodness, I could go on. There's several of them.
There's a lot. The Equinoxes.
Commentaries? What about commentaries?
Yeah, Equinox 4.1 and 4.2, the commentaries, the Vision and the Voice, and so on. So this has been the essence of the collaboration between the two orders, is to present the material to students in a trustworthy, quality way, so that they can have material they know is genuine, with intelligent commentary and notes added to it to help them in their studies. And
the method of science.
The method of science, the aim of religion.
Yes.
I am very proud to have been a part of it.
Yes, it's gone very, very well.
Yes, it has. And with that, I think we'll wrap up this discussion. I want to thank Ken Campo for joining us, and J.Daniel Gunther for most of his stories, which have been very interesting and illuminating. But it does make you appreciate what you have now, if you know how little there was out there, even just, one lifetime ago. And
True.
And with that, I'm going to wrap up the podcast, and I want to say thank you to all the listeners out there. Until next time, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.